I want to welcome you and wish you a good morning this morning. We are hosting our third Backpack to Briefcase session, and we have this particular series gives you an opportunity to hear from industry professionals who are talking about current pertinent topics that you're going to be dealing with in a recruiting season that will be like none other. So this morning, we're excited to introduce you to Chelsea Yoshikawa. And I was actually one of her career coaches when she was a student at Utah State University, and I love sharing her success story. So she is a sales associate, senior sales associate at General Mills. She has several key customers, and I was doing some research this morning and found that her key customers, Amazon, wholesale grocery, and Target, are all in the top 50 in Fortune 500. They are 5, 15, and 38 respectively. And that's pretty impressive that that group of accounts are such amazing companies. So just a little bit of background on Chelsea. She was a dual major in the Huntsman School of Business. We had one intern with General Mills before they came to recruit after they were so impressed with that first intern. And Chelsea was in the group of 5, I call them the Fab 5 with General Mills, who they came back that second year and hired 5 interns instead of just 1. And of the 5, and they were all outstanding students, Chelsea was the most impressive to General Mills. In speaking to their recruiter, Kurt Curtis, he told me how she had blown away General Mills with her analytic skills. And I just think she has been a rising star from the Huntsman School of Business since day one. So we'll turn the time over to her and let her share with you her advice and her tips. If you have questions, you're welcome to submit those on the chat, and we'll try to address those questions as we go along. If we're not able to, we'll save them for the end.
Great, thank you, Marion, for that very generous introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen. Will you just let me know when you can see it? Can you see my screen, Marion? Okay, awesome. Well, there's nothing more right now than I wish that we could be face-to-face chatting about interviews. It is something that I am extremely passionate about and that I love to help coach fellow Aggies and other peers of mine on how to effectively interview, and specifically how to ask powerful questions in an interview. So I'm really excited to be with you guys here today virtually. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions via chat on YouTube. If you guys have any questions, Marion will stop me in the presentation to ask them, or we can ask additional questions at the end. Okay, so ultimately the goals of what I want to get out today is to get you guys to help prepare you guys on how to be an expert in preparing for interviews, specifically how to prepare really, really powerful questions. At the end of the day, what sets candidates apart more often than not in an interview is the questions they ask and the level of preparation they do ahead of time. Secondly, preparing for interviews just naturally will result in a huge boost of confidence. And so going into an interview, I want to see each and every one of you be extremely confident when you're walking into that interview. And ultimately, the end goal of today is, if there's a dream job that you guys have, I want you guys to get that job, and you're going to get it by understanding how to prepare and how to set yourself apart against other candidates. So before we jump into that, I'll just say a little bit about me and where I work. As Marin mentioned, I have worked for General Mills ever since graduating from Utah State University in 2018. I've worked on several accounts, like Marin said, such as Amazon, working in e-commerce, to now managing their Target account. And in addition to my day-to-day sales job, I am also the Utah State sales recruiting lead, which means when you guys have that virtual Huntsman career fair coming up in a couple of weeks, I will be there presenting on General Mills, talking about the job opportunities that we have, and ultimately interviewing several individuals from Utah State for the positions. And so from my experience over the past couple of years of being in this role, I have learned, one, a lot of information of what sets candidates truly apart being on the other side of interviews, as well as going through interviews while in college myself. I learned a lot of how to properly prepare and how to set yourself apart. So a little bit more about General Mills. We have a ton of beloved brands. I know that anytime I say General Mills, people think of like the classic Cheerios brand. But on the screen, you can see we do a wide assortment of products, both within the United States and internationally. And so I'm really proud of the brands that we work on and how much of households that we have, like nostalgia just from growing up with these beloved brands. Okay, so getting into preparing for interview questions, I want to first talk about the type of interview questions you should be preparing ahead of time. First is rapport. At the beginning of an interview, you should always get to know the person that you're interviewing with. At the end of the day, the person that's interviewing you also wants to know, can I see myself working with this person? Is this someone that I would want to see on a day-to-day basis? So it's super important to build rapport, especially if you get nervous going into interviews. Oftentimes it's easy to forget like the basics of having a conversation. If you're someone who naturally does get nervous, then it's good to prep rapport questions ahead of time. And you can, if you want to be an expert in preparation, something you can do is research the person you're interviewing with ahead of time via LinkedIn. I put an example. If you see they graduated from Alabama or from another school that's prominent in sports and there's a huge football game coming up tomorrow, then you can ask if they'll be watching, or if they're not, then follow up with asking what else they'll be doing over the weekend. Try to prep just 1 or 2 solid rapport questions, because in the end, it's super helpful when you're sending a follow-up email at the end to touch base on that rapport question you touched on. For example, if Marin was interviewing me and she graduated from Alabama, I would say, hey, Marin, thanks so much for interviewing me today. I hope you have a great weekend watching the Alabama game with your friends and family. But then you would also do the additional follow-up, additional like things that you would follow up in that email with, but it's just one last little sweet thing you can add on top. It's a good cherry on top. Secondly, the types of questions you want to prep going into an interview is business related questions. You want to spend the most amount of your time researching the company, talking to people who work at that company to better understand what the hot topics are. And we'll get into that a little bit more in detail later. And lastly, you always want to ask for feedback and to understand what the next steps are in the interview process. So first, we're going to talk about preparation, specifically for those business-related questions that I touched on previously. So first, you really want to do your research on the company. This is something that anyone can do, okay? Anyone, all the other candidates who are interviewing for the same position that you are probably doing this. So you want to make sure you're spending an efficient amount of time understanding the company. A good place that I recommend that I wish that I utilized even more when I was in college was, if it's a publicly traded company, have you looked at their most recent quarterly earnings report? I was not a finance major, and I feel like whenever I heard quarterly earnings report, I think that's just a bunch of numbers that are going to blow over my head. But oftentimes companies report on what they're doing in terms of allyship, what their focus on is for the culture, and yes, what is happening within the business financially. This will give you a huge understanding of what's happening in the business. And again, if it's a publicly traded company, the information is out there. You just have to go and look it up. You can also look up current news articles about the company. If it's a larger company, you should understand what are the hot topics, what type of organizations is this company donating money to at this time? What is their philanthropic, or what is their community service that they often tie themselves to, and just looking up different news articles of different initiatives that they're doing. And then lastly, if you're not finding anything like researching on the company specific, then research hot topics for the industry that that company competes in. So if you're interviewing for a CPG company, which is consumer products goods, which is what General Mills does, you can research other CPG competitors, or you can research what's happening with consumer products, especially with COVID right now. You guys have a unique understanding to really do a lot of research on how COVID's specifically impacting a business industry or a specific company, and ask really, really good questions that's tied to that. Secondly, you should use your network, or I like to say, create your network. I always recommend to anyone who's interviewing with a company to reach out to people on LinkedIn who work for that company in that job that you are interviewing for, and just ask if you can set up a 10-minute call to ask some quick questions with them. Or you can use your network that you already have. Marin is a great example of an individual you can utilize. She has helped several Aggies get their dream jobs. And if there's a company that you know a fellow Aggie has, chances are Marin has a connection and can help at least make the connection so you can reach out to them. You can also use different faculty members to ask around, or friends, and ask around if they know anyone that works for this company, and see if they can get you in touch with someone. It is something that I used to do while going to school at Utah State. I remember I interviewed for a role at IBM, and it turned out there was a professor at Utah State who used to work at IBM like 15 years ago. So I went and chatted with them about their experience, as well as got some additional contacts of people who still work there, so I could reach out to them to be able to understand what like their day-to-day life looks like. So you should use, when reaching out to your network or creating a network, you should understand what their day-to-day life looks like. This is a prime time for you to understand the company culture and to see if this is a place that you could see yourself working post-college. For example, if you ask that standard question of what a day-to-day job, like what your life looks like day-to-day in your job, if someone says they get in to work at 7 a.m. and they get home at 9 p.m., then you can take away that that's going to be a very like demanding job where it's work, work, work all the time. And that's something that, like, if that motivates you and something you want, you can chase after it. Or if you want a job that's more work-life balance, and maybe that's something you take away and look for a company that aligns with like what type of day-to-day you want to have as well. And then lastly, when you're talking to an individual, or specifically someone who has that job, it's super important to understand what's hot and what the current hurdles are within the workplace. That's something that I always ask when prepping for an interview with someone who has previously had that role, or with someone who's currently in the role that I'm interviewing for. Because one, this helps you shape your answers to the interview questions based on like how you can help solve the hurdles within the workplace. And it helps you, like, it helps discover what's most important to the company at that time, and will just help you really stand out and be a really stellar candidate. And lastly, when you're preparing, you just want to thoughtfully, like, you want to craft your interview questions, the questions you will ask the interview, along with how you're going to answer their questions via the STAR response. So I usually like to prep 3 questions ahead of time that I have written down that I am planning on asking throughout the interview. So an example of a strong question, I put one below. If, for example, if I were interviewing someone, this is an example of a strong question. Due to COVID, I know that service continues to be a hurdle at General Mills. How does this dynamic impact your customer relationship? That question shows that you did research and shows that you are very aware with what's happening in the business environment, but it also shows that you realize, like, service is a huge impact that affects sales. That's an awesome question to ask. And so you want to always ask questions that show that you did research, but also add a question of how you can have a conversation about your research that you have done. Okay, so when it comes to utilizing your preparation, I am going to give you 2 really hot tips. So if this is your dream job that you want, and you want to be very bold and you want to stand out, this is a tip that I was given my junior year of college, and ever since I implemented this strategy, I have gotten every single job that I have interviewed for. Not every job that I've applied for, but every single job that I have gotten the opportunity to be bold and stand out. I took that opportunity and really differentiated myself from other candidates. So the way an interview is always structured is they're going to have 20 minutes for them to ask you questions, 5 minutes for you to ask them questions. If you want to be bold and stand out, ask the interviewer if you can ask your questions first before you dive into the interview. There's already time allotted for you to ask questions. So why not ask it at the beginning? What this will do is it'll allow you to ask really thoughtful questions, and based on their answers, it'll help you strengthen how you answer your questions, because it'll show what's most important to them, and it'll help show you what you should align your answers on most importantly.
Chelsea, a question that just came through from one of our graduate students, Christina Brown, is, are there any questions that students shouldn't ask or be careful about asking?
Yeah, you know what? Like, I will say 2 things. Christina, first, thank you for asking a question. I really appreciate it. One, I'd say in an interview, you really shouldn't ask for, like, understanding how much, like, what the salary is or what compensation is until you get that job offer. You should do your research to understand what that looks like ahead of time. Like, you should have a really good understanding going into the job interview. And that is something that you negotiate after you get the job offer. It's just kind of awkward, like, of a question to get to, like, to ask an interview. And secondly, like, I'm not saying you shouldn't ask, like, culture related questions, but I am always so bummed when I am interviewing a candidate and they just ask, like, the fluffy questions, such as, like, what do you love about working at General Mills? That is a question that, like, my niece could ask, or my 4-year-old nephew could ask. So, not to say that you shouldn't ask those questions, but if you want to be sharp and stand out, you should only save time for really thoughtful, powerful questions.
Great ideas. One other question from a graduate student, Sarah Jensen, wanted to know, if the interviewing is going long, is it ever okay to skip questions?
Yeah, you know what? I always love to prioritize questions. In my experience, interviews should be more conversational, meaning if you don't want to be bold and stand out at the beginning and ask if you can ask questions at the beginning and you're running out of time, like, hopefully you are exchanging questions back and forth. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge, like if it's a 30-minute interview and you're coming up on 25 minutes, it's appropriate to acknowledge like and ask like, hey, I really had some really, I've had some thoughtful questions I've been really wanting to ask. I know we're at time. Do you have 5 extra minutes for me to be able to ask these questions? If not, or if they say, you know what, no, I have an interview right after, you can ask for another person they can put you in contact with to ask those questions. Or you can follow up with them and say, you know what, I'd love to continue the conversation. I have some really great questions to ask you. What's the best, like, based on like what the interview process is, it's a good opportunity for you to ask for that second interview or to communicate with them after the interview as well. But in my opinion, you should always save time for your questions as well. An interview is just as much you interviewing the company as them interviewing you, and you really want to make yourself stand out. So at least make sure you're getting in one really strong question. There's time to cut back the number of questions you ask, but make sure you ask at least one strong question. Marion, thank you for inputting those questions. And again, feel free to keep them coming. And then secondly, you just want to really show that you researched the company. I touched on this just recently, but as you answer their questions, make sure that you're showcasing the preparation. Tie your research into how you're answering the interview questions, and it'll really, really make you stand out. So I won't touch on this too much, especially given the amount of time we have, but everyone knows, or you should know, the STAR method. The STAR method is the recommended method of answering any interview question. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. So for an example, when you are prepping, like when you're going into an interview, you should have at least 3 stories written down of a situation, task, the action you did, and the result of you doing that action going into the interview that's related to that business position. And so this is just an example. Honestly, this was an example General Mills has provided previously of a STAR method of how to answer a question. I can send this, again, you can come back to YouTube, take a screenshot of this page, but here's an example of a good example and how to make it great. But what I also want to say is if you are an expert preparer and you do a ton of research ahead of time, this is like how to be a superstar and how to really exemplify that STAR method and just take it one level further. So you can answer the situation / task, you can talk about your action, and you can talk about your result. But what really sets people apart is when they relate it. When they relate what their actions and results did back to the job position, it lays out a very clear line of sight to how their background and strengths will impact my company. And it makes it really easy for me to point out, like, this person is going to be an excellent candidate and be an excellent employee because they'll be able to do this for our company. So if you find out what those hurdles are ahead of time, you can relate it back to the company and say how you specifically and your strengths will impact General Mills or whatever company you're interviewing for. Marion, did you have another question?
I do. You mentioned earlier that feedback should be part of the interview. And the question is from another graduate student, Mandy Windsor, would like to know, how do you go about asking for feedback?
Yes, good question, Mandy. Also, I love all the females asking questions. Thank you so much. We'll touch on it on this slide right here. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the closing questions. One, it's usually really good to understand what the next steps are in the interview process. If the next step is a second interview, then it's good to know so you can ask for that second interview. Or if this next step is deciding if you get a job offer or not, then you can close the interview by asking for the job. So secondly, you really want to ask for feedback. These are two examples. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see examples of how I like to word it, because it's awkward to be like, say, do you have feedback for me? But a good way of pairing it up is saying, hey, from our conversation, are there any hesitations that you have in moving forward with me in the interview process? What this does is it allows them to give you one, positive feedback, and two, say if there are any hesitations, and if there are, you can have one last chance to resolve any concern they have. Or you can ask if there's anything that was left unclear that they want you to expand on, to set yourself as the lead candidate. So these are questions that you are welcome to use anytime. And then lastly, the closing question, again, if this is your dream job, then ask for the job. If the next step in the interview process is a second round interview, say that you want a second interview and that you'd love to move forward in the process, especially if they don't have any hesitations or they don't give any negative feedback. Then you can say, based on your feedback, like, I would love the opportunity to get a second round interview. I think I'd be a great fit for the job because X, Y, and Z, and I'd love to continue the conversation. Or you can ask for the job. A way that I love to close interviews, if this is my dream job, I will tell the person interviewing me that, look, this is my dream job, and just so you guys know, you guys are my top priority. If given the job offer, I will accept. I will say that in an interview because, one, it lays out very clear where your priorities are if it's your dream job. And two, companies want to hire people that want to work for them, that are motivated by the company. And so if it's your dream job, let it be clear that you will be accepting this job offer. Of course, you can worry about the salary negotiation later, but at the end of the day, like, we want to hire people that want to work for General Mills. So if this is your dream job, then ask for it. But again, I would only ask for it or say that if that is your top priority and you do know you would accept. So that's pretty much all I have prepared for in terms of interview questions. Hopefully we learned a little bit more about how to prep rapport questions, business related questions, and closing questions, but I wanted to leave time for any remaining questions that you guys have.
So we have a number of questions coming through, but given the fact that we only have a couple of minutes left, what I would like to do is encourage the students to connect with you on LinkedIn and continue this conversation, if that's okay, Chelsea.
Yeah.
Chelsea is an amazing resource. And one of the things that she's most passionate about is seeing Aggies succeed. So learning her tips and tricks is one of the best ways you can land that dream job.
Yeah, and where we are at time, I just want to let you guys know, like, feel free to, like, I will respond way quicker if you were to send me an email than a LinkedIn message, just because I check email first and foremost. You are more than welcome to reach out to me. My contact information is just chelsea.yoshikawa@genmills.com. I'm pretty sure you can find it on LinkedIn as well. But if you guys have any additional questions about what we reviewed today, or if you're about to go into an interview and want to ask someone quick questions, no question is off the table. I'd love to answer anything and be as transparent as I can from the eyes of a recruiter, just to help you guys get jobs. So feel free to reach out anytime.
So if we were all together, we would give you a round of applause and tell you great tips, great ideas. Just a reminder for the students, Dean Anderson will be presenting the Leadership Forum at 10:30. And then at 11:30, we have another Backpack to Briefcase series involving Koch Industries, a panel that Mandy Stottle will be moderating. And then next week, definitely register for She's Daring Mighty Things. That's always a wonderful activity fall semester starts out with, and we're anxious to see everyone at that event. So thanks for joining us. One more big thank you to Chelsea. She's amazing, and we just love to claim her as one of our great success stories.
Thanks, Marin. Appreciate the invite and the conversation.